out right now, so if you don't get a copy, please raise your hand. Make sure we get you one of those. We are on beginning lesson 11 today in our survey of the Bible. We'll be looking obviously at Judah and the prophets to Judah. And I'll go ahead and promise you now, we're not going to cover everything for Judah today because they lasted longer, about 100 years longer than Israel did. So it's going to take us about 2 weeks to cover them. But we're getting closer to the end. We will have, after this, the exile and return, and then we'll move into the New Testament, and that'll be it. So maybe about 3-4 more weeks, and we should be finished with this survey. Everybody should have a sheet with blanks and then also a timeline. If you didn't get either one or neither of those, if you raise your hand, you get it. All right, just as a brief review, if you recall last week we were looking at the northern kingdom of Israel. We'll go back and refresh our memories about that just a moment, about how the kingdom divided. But we looked at the northern kingdom of Israel, how they mostly had wicked kings, and we finished up last week with them being carted off into Assyrian captivity. Now we're going to jump back in time a little bit. We're going to go to the southern kingdom of Judah and look at some of their kings and the prophets there, prophesied to them, and again, lessons we can learn from that. So, again, if you'll look at the timeline that we've been given there, and I've got it up here on the screen as well. During the time of Saul, David, and Solomon, that's what was known as the United Kingdom. It lasted about 120 years. And then the kingdom divided after Solomon's death. They called it his son Rehoboam, which we're discussing, actually talking about right now. He ascended the throne, but you recall he asked opinions of the older advisors and then the younger advisors as to how he should run the kingdom, basically. And what was the older advisor's advice to Rehoboam? I remember? Okay, lighten up on the people. Your father Solomon, he was pretty hard on them, taxes, and later on that they said, lighten the load and they'll love you. They'll like you as a king, they'll follow you. So then he calls in the younger advisors, and what was their advice? Be tougher, be harder than your father was. And which one did he decide to listen to? The younger ones. Okay? So that's why the kingdom split. As we talked about last week, one of Solomon's former advisors, Jeroboam, their names are similar, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Jeroboam took 10 tribes and broke off and formed the northern kingdom of Israel. Rehoboam stayed on the throne, but he only kept 2 tribes. If you'll look up here, we've got, again, a map that shows this is a rough division here, about 925 BC. The borders were kind of constantly changing because of all the battles and the fighting and the conquests and all the stuff that were going on during this whole time. So Judah obviously only has 2 tribes, Judah and Israel, much smaller land area than the land of Israel, the northern kingdom had right there, but still a kingdom nonetheless. Now, one of the things that Rehoboam did, this would be Roman numeral 1 on your outline. Right here, Rehoboam, obviously he established idol worship. We talked about that. How one of the first things he did was erected 2 what? You might remember? Golden calves. Okay? One in the northern part, that was Jeroboam. Okay? Jeroboam did in the northern kingdom. Rehoboam, after the kingdom split, he decided that he was also going to bring in idol worship, but instead of golden calves, he brought in what are known as the Asherah worship. Asherah was one of the false gods of that area. You recall, we talked about all the way back in Joshua, when the children of Israel came in to take over the land, and God had commanded them to get rid of the people and their idol worship completely, drive them out of the land. And they didn't do it then. And lasted all through the time of the judges. It was there during the United Kingdom, although not quite as much until Solomon came around and his wives turned his heart away. But now Rehoboam is in the throne, and so he brings that idol worship in, once again, especially the Asherah worship. And you'll see as we go through this, and if you're reading in Kings and Chronicles, you'll see this Asherah or Asherah poles talked about over and over again. Asherah was basically a Canaanite fertility goddess whose symbol was a tree. Some scholars think it kind of represented the tree of life. And what people would do is they would either carve the tree trunk of a living tree, or they would cut down trees and carve, kind of like what we see totem poles today, up in Alaska or Native American, things like that. It was similar to that. And they would worship these things. And they would set these up. Some people had them in their yards. They were placed strategically all throughout the kingdom, especially, and you'll see this crop up again as well, on what were known as the high places. The high places were either natural elevations, like small hills or small mountains, where people would sacrifice and put these things up, or if it was a city or a town, they would just build platforms, these raised areas, to put these poles up. And I mention that because we're going to see this recurring over and over again as we go throughout this lesson. So that's one of the things that Rehoboam did, was bringing in idol worship, especially Asherah. Rehoboam was invaded later on in his rule by Shishak, king of Egypt. And Shishak carried away a lot of the treasures from the temple, a lot of the things that Solomon had put in there. You remember that during Solomon's reign, the temple was built, and it was just, this amazing edifice and just kind of the talk of the area. Well, Shishak came in and kind of ransacked it and stole a lot of those things. One thing about Rehoboam, though, was later in his reign, towards the end of his reign, he did repent of these things that he had done. He repented for not following God, and he tried to make things right. But it was kind of too little too late at that point. And again, there's a lot more that's covered on most of these kings. I'm just going to be hitting some of the highlights. I encourage you to go back and read if you want more details, because we're just not going to have time to hit them. I just kind of want to go through and hit some of the highlights of each of these kings here. All right, so after Rehoboam came Asa, his son, Asa. And he was the first of a few good kings in Judah. Remember, we talked about in Israel, there really wasn't any king, one king that could be considered good. There were some that were not as bad as other ones. There were some that the Bible tells us kind of followed God a little bit or tried to, but they also brought in other things. So in Israel, there really wasn't a good king at all. Judah did have some good kings. And we see the first one here in Asa. Now, what made Asa good? Well, one of the first things he did was he cut down the Asherah poles and the high places. So when he came into power, he saw what Rehoboam had done, and he decided that, we're going to follow God. And so he had those idol worship things cut down. And that's why you see the term cut down, because they were these poles or these carved trees. And so they were probably literally taking saws and hatchets and axes to these things to chop them down, to get rid of them. Now, one of the interesting things that's mentioned about Asa, before that, he removed the Asherah poles in the high places, and even though Scripture doesn't say it, by the time his son came onto the throne, they apparently had crept back in because his son had to do the same thing. So you can see that even though he as the king tried to do what was right and to get rid of these things, the people still wanted them. And he wasn't able to get rid of them completely, but he was noted for following God. One of the things about Asa is it's mentioned that he had an army of 580,000 men. Now, again, if you go back and you look at that map of the land area of Judah, anybody have any idea what you could compare the land area of Judah to this day to give us an idea of how big the kingdom of Judah was, physically speaking? Okay. About the size of Northwest Florida. but he had an army of 580,000 men that were stationed in Jerusalem. They were stationed in Jerusalem, and he had others who were in the fortified city. So, big army. Why do you think you needed an army that big for such a small area? Okay, they were constantly being invaded. That's one reason. But why so many men? That's kind of a trick question, but not really. You just have to kind of stop and think. Back then, mortality rates in the military were very high, especially in battle. We'll see here later that in some battles, you have over 100,000 men lost in one battle. So they had to have these really big armies in order to make sure they had enough people to fight. Okay? Asa was not perfect, even though he was one of the first good kings. He made a treaty with the country of Aram and their king, and after he gets back from making that treaty, he's rebuked for not trusting God. One of the prophets comes to him and says, you know what, you should have done, you should have made this treaty. You should have trusted God to help you. You don't need to make treaties with these other people, especially these people that worship false gods, these other kingdoms that are not following God. You don't need to have alliances with them. So he was rebuked for that. Everybody got that? We'll move on. All right, the next king that we read about is Jehoshaphat. Jumping Jehoshaphat. That's where we get that part of that Jehoshaphat. He was not a jumping king or anything. I actually tried to look it up to see if there was any connection. That term, jumping Jehoshaphat, didn't come about until the 1800s here in the United States. So, not exactly sure why, but his name got connected to it. Anyway, Jehoshaphat, he was Asa's son, and he also tried to rid the land of idol worship. Again, even though his father had already done this and had crept back in, by the time he ascends to the throne, it's going on again. So he goes through and he cuts down the Asherah poles. But one thing it tells us is that he did not remove the high places. He did not remove the high places. One of the things that Asa did do, though, was that he sent officials and priests through the land to teach the law of Moses to the people. Before, it was kind of up to the people to either come to the temple in Jerusalem or to go to the various places that were set up throughout the kingdom where the priests may have been living, or there were other places besides Jerusalem where God allowed approved sacrifices to take place. They could travel there, but what Jehoshaphat did was he said, I'm going to send these people I'm going to send these teachers to the people. I'm going to wait for the people to come to us. And so he sent these officials and the priests to teach the law to the people because, again, he's trying to follow God. One of the things that Jehoshaphat did too was he reformed the justice system in his time, and he appointed judges over the people that they could come to with their disputes. One of the things we'll see later on is that became a big problem in Judah was the oppression of the poor and those who were without, and the rich began to kind of rule over them. And so Jehoshaphat, at least during his time, he's trying to stop that from happening. So he appoints these judges to be there for the people to settle these disputes. Now, if you thought Asa's army was big, Jehoshaphat had an army of 1.16 million that were stationed in Jerusalem. And then he also had others who were stationed throughout the various fortified cities. Now, to give you an idea of how big this army is, okay? Anybody know the current size of the United States military, roughly? All branches. Any guesses? Okay. About 1.3 million active duty in all branches of the military. There's about 800,000 more, give or take, in the reserves. He had 1.16 million soldiers just in Jerusalem in an area the size of Northwest Florida. You think he was ready for battle? Yeah, he was ready for battle. Now, like his father, he also allied, with Aram and was rebuked when he turned return home. You think these guys would have learned from the mistakes of their fathers, but apparently they didn't. Now, one of the reasons he did was because the Moabites were getting ready to attack Judah. Moab was one of the lands, I believe, to the east of Judah. They're getting ready to attack. He makes this alliance. Again, he's rebuked. And then he prays to God. And he says, God, basically, and you can look there in the passage and see what his prayer is, but he basically goes to God and says, you know what, I need your help. We're going to get wiped out. Even though he had this huge army, okay? He felt like they were going to get wiped out, and so he prayed to God, and so God heard his prayer, and he listened to him. It is a very interesting story, and I'll just give it to you briefly. While the Moabites were approaching, they had also allied themselves with some other nations, and long story short, God caused them, whether through miraculous means or natural means, whatever, for two of the nations that had allied with the Moabites to turn against them on the way to the fight. They wiped them out, and then those two armies fought amongst themselves and wiped each other out. So that, and the Bible says not one person was left. And in fact, when Jehoshaphat and his army get up the next morning, they kind of go out and survey the situation, and they look around and go, where is everybody? And they go into the camp, and they see all the dead bodies, and there's nobody left. They had all killed one another. And so they looted the camp and took back animals and possessions and all those things because God had given them the victory. They didn't have to pick up a sword and fire an arrow or anything. That shows you God's power. He wanted to take care of his people. All right, the next king we have is Jehoram. Jehoram, again, this is Jehoshaphat's son. Remember, we are still in the lineage of David here. Rehoboam was Solomon's son. Solomon was David's son. Okay? So through Judah, the line of David continues. All these are going to be sons of previous kings, with the exception of one. We'll get there in just a moment. Now, Jehoram was not a good king. In fact, he was one of the worst that Judah had. The reason was because he married a daughter of King Ahab, who was king in Israel. And we know Ahab's name, right? We know Ahab, and especially his wife. Who was Ahab's wife? Jezebel. Okay? One of the most wicked kings that the northern kingdom had. So Jehoram decides he's going to marry one of Ahab's daughters and form not an alliance, not to bring the kingdom back together, but you can see now there's some connection there between Judah and Israel now, because the king of Judah has married the daughter of the king of Israel. And of course, they had some alliances together. One of the things that Jehoram did was he brought down some of Ahab's advisors to be his advisors. Not a good move there. Because of that, one thing that happened to Jehoram is that all but his youngest son and all of his wives were captured and killed in battle. I don't know how many wives he had, but all of his wives and all of his sons, except for his youngest son, were captured and killed in battle. Another thing about Jehoram, and this is not pretty, but it's in the Bible, so I'll mention it real quickly. It was prophesied against him. In fact, it came in a mysterious letter from the prophet Elijah. You remember, Elijah prophesied to the northern kingdom of Israel. By this time, he has already been taken up into the whirlwind and the fiery chariot. He's been taken to heaven. But this letter arrives from Elijah to Jehoram. And biblical scholars aren't even sure where it came from, but apparently either came from heaven or Elijah had written it before he died, whatever. It came to him and it prophesied against him, and there was a prediction made. He said, you're going to have this bad bowel disease, and in fact, it's going to kill you. It's going to be so bad that your bowels are going to come out of your body. That's how it's worded in Scripture there. And so that's what happened to Jehoram. He was struck with this disease, and it lingered for a while until eventually it did kill him. And the Bible says, his bowels eventually came out of his body. I don't know what disease this would have been, if it was something miraculous or something that doctors might know today, but that was what was prophesied against him, and that happened. Not a very good way to go. All right. Everybody got these blanks? Move on. Okay. The next king, actually, the next thing that we have here, we we'll get to not necessarily a king, but there is a king. So we had Jehoshaphat, then Jehoram. This is where the timeline is continuing on here. Now you'll notice that in some of these, in the little key down here, it talks about overlapping co-regencies. What that means is that the way that they figured in Bible times was when a king's son was born, especially the firstborn son, it was assumed that he would go on the throne, they counted that as part of his reign, but it was kind of done retroactively. So he didn't take the throne until his father was dead, but then when they counted his reigning years, they went back all the way to the time he was born. So that's why you see some of these overlapping, what they call co-regencies here, okay? So just keep in mind that they don't ascend the throne until their father has died. But when you read the biblical account, it talks about the number of years. You might get to go, well, this doesn't add up. It's because they count from the time they were born as part of their reign as king. And you'll see here that some of these do not reign very long at all. In fact, the very next one we're going to talk about is Ahaziah and Athaliah. Ahaziah and Athaliah. You'll see why we've got both of those on here in just a moment. Ahaziah, of course, was Jehoram's son. He was the youngest son that was not killed of Jehoram. And Ahaziah was also evil. And he was killed while he was visiting the king of Israel. Now remember, his father had married one of Ahab's daughters. We don't know if that was his mother. Probably wasn't his mother. He had multiple wives. But there was still that relationship between Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. So he's going to visit the northern king of Israel. It was the king after Ahab, I forget who it was. And he is killed while he's visiting the king of Israel. He's struck with an arrow and killed. And so his mother, Athaliah, basically usurped the throne at that point. She saw that her son was dead. He had some children, but she didn't want any of them to reign in his stead, so she took over the throne. And in fact, what she did was she tried to kill the remaining royal family. She put all of the other royal heirs to death, or tried to. She missed one. I'll talk about it in just a second. The one that she missed was a little boy, actually a baby, named Joash. He was hidden by his aunt, who was Ahaziah's sister, so his father's sister, the king's sister, for 6 years. Athaliah is trying to put everyone to death so that she can hold on to that power. But Joash is hidden until he's 6 years old, basically until Athaliah dies, and he can be brought out in public there. And Athaliah was killed in a military coup that then put Joash on the throne. Those who were still loyal to Joash and to the family, at that point they made an alliance and they formed this coup basically. And they came out and they proclaimed Joash king in public. And the instructions were, whoever doesn't follow us and acknowledge Joash, you put him to death. And of course Athaliah, she was one of those, and so they put her to death. They killed her and put Joash on the throne. All right, so that brings us to Joash. This will be Roman numeral 6 on your outline there, bottom of the first page. Joash. Again, he ascended the throne or became king at 7 years old. Now, do you think a 7-year-old could really reign well? No. And in fact, he was the legitimate king, but he wasn't the one making all the decisions at 7 years old. Okay? He had an uncle by the name of Jehoiada, kind of a mouthful, Jehoiada, who was the priest at the time. And Jehoiada became basically his advisor. And he helped him make the decisions. In fact, he kind of made the decisions for him up to a certain point. But he helped Joash rule. And they were good. They followed God. Under Jehoiada's guidance, the people rededicated themselves to God. However, the altars, the high places and the altars were not destroyed, and the people continued to offer sacrifices and to burn incense there. Now, it's easy for us, going over this in about 30 to 45 minutes to say, well, why didn't they see this? Why didn't they see the trap and just go ahead and get rid of those things? You got to remember, years and years pass sometimes between these things happening, and in some ways it's harder to see in the moment than it is for us. But this is a recurring thing. These kings, even though they try to follow God, they don't remove completely the idol worship or the avenues of idol worship there, and it just keeps being a problem for them. One of the things Joash did is he collected a tax in order to repair the temple. So they collected these things and gave the money to the craftsmen in order to repair the temple. Unfortunately for Joash, after Jehoiada died, after Jehoiada's death, Joash listened to the officials, and he himself turned to idol worship. So once his uncle, once his conscience, if you will, was gone out of the picture, he was easily swayed. And so he turned to idol worship, and in doing that, turned the country back to idol worship. Another thing that Joash did, this is kind of a sad ending to his reign, once Jehoiada died, his uncle died, Jehoiada had a son, and when he saw what Joash was doing, he came to him and intervened with him. He said, my father, he would never allow this, and you're disrespecting him. And Joash's response was to kill Jehoiada's son. His name was Zechariah, for rebuking him. During the end of his reign, the Syrian army invaded, and Joash took treasures from the temple and paid the king of Syria to withdraw and to leave them alone. But during some of the battles, Joash was wounded. He returned back to the palace and eventually was assassinated by his own officials. So it started off good when he was a young boy, and he had people surrounding him that were helping him to follow God. But once they were gone, his heart was turned, and he met kind of a sad end there. All right, during this time of Joash, we have the prophet Joel who comes on the scene. You see right here on the timeline. Joash is the king, kind of in gray here, right there. Joel is also the prophet we had in gray. He prophesied during the reign of Joash. Most of his prophecy was done at the beginning of Joash's reign, early in his reign. One of the things that happened during that time was that a plague of locusts came and destroyed almost all the crops of Judah. In fact, so much so that it started a famine. There wasn't enough for people to eat. And it's interesting the way that it's worded there in Joel. It talks about, the biggest locust came in. Whatever they didn't eat, the next biggest ones came in. It goes through about 4 different things until the tiniest one ate what was left. And there was absolutely nothing left in the fields. And I bring that up is because Joel used this disaster of the locusts to warn Israel. He uses it basically as an example lesson, or an object lesson. He says, in his prophecy, if you read the first part of the book of Joel, he says, okay, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but he says, all right, you remember the locusts, you remember what happened. You think that was bad? If you don't change and repent, it's going to be even worse when the judgment of God comes on you. So he tries to use this as an example to get them to see. And they knew that it was bad. I mean, there was a famine. They had nothing to eat. Things were really going bad. Joel's like, this is nothing compared to what it's going to be like if you don't change and repent. And that was Joel's basic message. Of course, we know that people didn't really listen, as they always didn't really listen. And so we get to the next king. And that is the king Amaziah. Amaziah was Joash's son, obviously. And we're back to the lineage here. Athaliah tried to stop that. She was not successful. So Amaziah was Joash's son. One of the first things that he did when he ascended to the throne was he had his father's assassins put to death. So his father was killed by some men, and he had those men killed. Now, Amaziah followed God, but again, guess what? What did he not do? Talking cheap, right up there. He didn't remove the high places. That's what, the third or fourth king that we've seen so far that did not remove the high places. Even though it says that they followed God, they wanted to do what was right, they were living right, they weren't getting rid of these things that were a snare and a trap to them constantly. He did not remove the high places. And the reason I bring this up is because it's mentioned in Scripture. As you go through Chronicles here, it says, so-and-so came, talks about when he came in power, and he followed God, but he did not remove the high places. He did not take down the Asherah pole. He did not do this. Now, an interesting story here about Amaziah. He captured 10,000 enemy troops in battle, kept them alive, brought them to a cliff. I don't know how high the cliff was, it doesn't say, and threw all 10,000 of these men off a cliff and killed them. Can you imagine? It was a very brutal and bloody time back in that day. And one of the things that Amaziah did was, of those 10,000 men that he defeated, or the whole army that he defeated, he brought back their idols and worshiped them. Again, it kind of boggles the mind that these guys kept turning to this idol worship. And there are some scholars, and I'll throw this in here, there are some scholars who think that it wasn't just a pure, oh, we're turning from God and we're going to this idol worship. Some scholars think that what they tried to do was bring the idols into the worship of God. We know for sure that at least one of the kings brought some of those idols into the temple. And so what they were trying to do possibly was to combine these two items of worship. They're going to worship God, at least in their minds, they're going to worship God, but they're also going to have these idols in there. So they're trying to fuse the two things together. And of course, it never worked. He challenged Israel, the northern kingdom, in battle and was defeated and captured. The reason he was defeated and captured was because he challenged Israel. In fact, he challenged Israel. The king of Israel at that time said, "You're nothing compared to us." I'm going to paraphrase him. He said, "You're nothing. You need to just go home and mind your own business." But he wouldn't do it. He went out and attacked him anyway and was soundly defeated in battle. And he returned home to reign until he also was assassinated. Again, a lot of political intrigue, a lot of this. This story right here would make a great movie plot. It would make a great soap opera, because that's really kind of what it is. It's just a big soap opera of these kings. They're good and then they turn bad. They're bad and they're punished. And just all these things are happening to them. It's kind of crazy. All right, during Amaziah's reign, we have, skip one. Let me go back. Azariah is the next one. I got ahead of myself there. Azariah, and I have Uzziah in parentheses there because he apparently had two names, or two different spellings of his name. So sometimes you'll see Azariah, sometimes you'll see Uzziah in the same passage there. Azariah was the son of Amaziah. And again, these names they sound similar and they get kind of confusing sometimes. And again, the Bible tells us he followed God, but did not what? Did not remove the high places. Remember, these histories that we're reading, Kings and Chronicles, they're for us, obviously, we can learn from them, but who were they originally written for? Who was the first audience for these books? Hey, the Jews, probably the Jews right after or even during the time of exile. And I think that's one reason that the writers keep pointing out over and over that these kings didn't remove the high places. They didn't completely get rid of idol worship because they're pointing out to these Jewish survivors who are going to come back into the land, look, here's what happened when they didn't get rid of these things. Don't y'all make the same mistake. And honestly, after the exile, they didn't. We don't ever see idol worship coming back into the Jewish system like that, but we see rather the self-righteousness and the rise of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all that, and just that empty religion instead of a false religion. All right, Amaziah had some success early in his reign, but due to his success, he became powerful. And that power led him to falling away from God, turning away from God. In fact, he got so powerful and so haughty and so full of himself that he decided he was going to go into the temple one day and burn incense. Now, what was the problem with that? Only the priests were allowed to burn incense in the temple. Even though he was the king, that was not something that he was allowed to do by God. So, as he's going into the temple to do this, God strikes him with leprosy. In fact, it appears immediately on his forehead, Scripture says. And the priests were like, "Oh, you got to get out of here." Because leprosy back then was almost a death sentence. And there were very strict laws concerning lepers. I got behind on the slide there. So he went to burn incense in the temple, was struck with leprosy. And as was according to the law, if you had leprosy, you basically had to be quarantined. Either sent to a leper colony, which became common for people with leprosy to just go and live by themselves together, or in the case of Azariah the king, he was just sent to a separate dwelling just outside the city with no contact from anyone else, and he basically died in quarantine. He didn't die immediately. He suffered with his leprosy for a while, but he was never able to come back into the city. He was never able to be around people anymore, and he died in quarantine with his leprosy. Again, all because of his haughty attitude, the idea that he felt like that he was powerful enough to go in and do these things that were forbidden. And God said, "No, you're not." All right, now it was during Azariah's reign that the prophet Isaiah came onto the scene. And again, if you'll look at your timeline there, you'll see Isaiah. Oops. Roger, can you fix me? I just did something. I killed it. Wait, let's see. Oh, wait, there we go. I got it. Okay. We're moving forward here. There. Here you can see on the timeline, here's Isaiah. Okay. Towards the end of Azariah's reign, we get here for Jotham. That's when Isaiah comes onto the scene. Now, Isaiah. If you've ever looked at the book of Isaiah, what do we see about that book as far as compared to some of the other prophets? What do you notice about the book of Isaiah? It's long. It's very long. In fact, it's one of the longest books at 66 chapters. It's the longest of the prophetic books. And Isaiah is considered one of the greatest of the prophets. In fact, with the exception of the Psalms, which we've looked at briefly, Isaiah's book contains the most prophecies concerning the Messiah, the coming Messiah. So you have the Psalms that contain the most, and then you have Isaiah. And in fact, we'll get to in a second, but Isaiah, just like the other prophets, he's warning about the coming judgment and captivity. He's one of the first ones that starts talking about captivity. The other ones were, hey, you need to repent, God's judgment is coming. They didn't necessarily mention the captivity. Isaiah begins by saying, you're going to be taken captive. You're going to be taken away from your homeland and you're going to serve someone else. But also part of Isaiah's message, especially the latter part of his book, is addressed to the exiles. Get right here. Chapters 40 through 66 are addressed to the future exiles in order to give them hope. So I know I skipped one here. So he prophesied about the Messiah. And then those last 26 chapters of his book are speaking to those future Israelites who will be in captivity and then return home after that 70 years. And that part of his book is to give them hope. And that's where a lot of his prophecies about the Messiah come in. And he's telling them, look, The Messiah is going to come. He's going to repair your relationship with God. He's going to make it where your sins can be forgiven. You know, all these things. He talks about Jesus' suffering. He talks about how he was born, his life, and then his death. He kind of covers the whole life of the Messiah and who he would be there. But it's written to give them hope. Because they're going to be coming back from the 70 years of exile. They're going to be coming to a